Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy EV mini-series. Neil, what are we going to talk about this week?
We have a super exciting guest this week, someone who has lived and breathed the electric vehicle transition and can give us depth and experience in both what has happened in the past, but hopefully what's going to happen in the future and indications of where we're going. We're going to be welcoming Roger Atkins, LinkedIn's top voice on electric vehicles, to talk to us a bit further about what it is he does and what he's seen on his journey through the electric vehicle ecosystem. So, Roger, if I can introduce you, what would you say about yourself? How did you get here? Where did you come from? Where are we going next?
There's a lot in that question. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, Neil and Chris, along to the show. I know you have a lot of very interesting people. You have a nice eclectic mix. That's always something that I'm attracted to, eclecticism. So I'm Roger Atkins. I'm 64. I've been around the auto industry more than anything else, although before that I was a musician and I tried to do a few things in that arena. Tried, but sadly failed. Nonetheless, picked myself up, dust myself down, and then I've had a long-standing career in automotive. To begin with, I was a car salesman. That's how I started. I liked the look of Saab cars in the mid-1980s. They were lovely then. And I discovered that if you were a car salesman, you got a free car. What's not to like? So that's where I began. A bunch of companies there, predominantly Volkswagen Group, Audi. Then I worked briefly for Mercedes for a short while. And then I jumped into startups. I worked for Richard Branson on Virgincars, which was in 1999, 2000, early stage startup for selling cars on the internet. And in the midst of the dot-com bubble, little did we know it, we were inside a bubble. And from there, I kind of have had an appetite for risk, I think, more than anything else. I think when you work with entrepreneurs and people who think differently and who are prepared to take chances, it kind of rubs off. So I've worked for a number of startups. Some of them have been successful, some of them have not. But more recently, in fact, the last nearly 9 years, I've worked for myself, which I would recommend to anybody at whatever age. If you can find a way to make a living working for yourself, that's the way to go.
That's fabulous. The Richard Branson piece for me is always the bit that's super interesting. I mean, he's a hero amongst many people's books, but he also went into cars. What did he do in the car world? What were you up to with Richard Branson in the car ecosystem?
Okay. Well, here's the thing. The Virgin brand, the Virgin name, is licensed to people. So there are a few hundred companies that have the Virgin name in it. It doesn't mean that Richard Branson runs them all. It didn't mean that Richard Branson ran Virgincars. It was run by a very interesting young man called Ian Lancaster. And Ian basically worked with Richard very closely to basically sell cars on the internet. So this fed into Mr. Branson's narrative, which was to offer the consumer a better offer than they were currently getting. And in the UK at that time, the UK was known as Treasure Island amongst the automotive players because they could charge more money and get it for selling cars in Great Britain than anywhere else in Europe, arguably anywhere else in the world. And Richard Branson saw that as unfair and wanted to do something about it. So in working with Ian Lancaster, very early on then, selling cars through a website via the phone. We had a call center. It was a hybrid system, really. It was still quite traditional. You rang someone up, you gave them your credit card details, and so on and so forth. And we got cars from countries like Denmark and Portugal and places where the tax regime was so draconian. But if you then imported those cars from the dealers in that location, you got them very cheap. And we passed on that cheapness to customers. So for some time, we were doing very well. But unfortunately then, despite a thing called block exemption, we discovered that it was a little bit difficult to get hold of cars. And some of the dealers that were helping us and dealer groups that were helping us had perhaps been, how can I put it politely, had the gypsies warning, I think is a phrase that's used. I don't know if we're allowed to use that anymore. But anyway, they'd been advised it wasn't wise to let this jumped up entrepreneur Richard Branson and co. Get hold of stock and sell it cheap. So that's what happened. But it was an extraordinary journey. It was a journey, I think, about 3 years, I think the company ran for. And when you think of how long ago that is, 23 years ago, selling cars on the internet and selling quite a lot of them, delivering them to people's homes, essentially cutting out the dealers, it was way ahead of its time, way ahead.
And that's pretty cool because that gave you the exposure to the sort of entrepreneurial approach to the ecosystem. But Richard Branson was doing some pretty crazy things at that time. Did he not do something with a boat going across the channel or something weird?
Oh, yes, indeed. So Virgincars didn't work out for me. It didn't work out, sadly, for anybody in the end. Fast forward a couple of years, I find myself then working for a company called Gibbs. And they had a product called the Gibbs Aquada, which was based pretty much on the Lotus Elise. And it was an amphibious sports car. It was tremendous. It was really, really exciting car. I mean, to look at, looked great. Then you drive it straight into the water. It would go up on what they call the plane, which is when, you've got a speedboat and you're picking up speed, go up on the plane within just a few seconds and then be whizzing along. And when I was at Gibbs, the thought there was, we need a good bit of promotion. We need to do things that are different. I worked for a very challenging entrepreneur there as well. I've often find myself in the company of people that are quite challenging, but they're people then typically who get things done. So Alan Gibbs challenged me to said we need an advertising strapline. We need something creative. Come up with it. And I said, well, it's not as simple as that, Alan. You typically storyboard these things, you analyze stuff, you talk to potential customers, you maybe go to a big agency in London. And he was an absolute classic Kiwi businessman. It was like, I don't want to do all of that rubbish. You come up with the idea. Come on. So he slightly, not literally, had me up against the wall, not literally. And I said, oh, I don't know, Alan, A to B via C? He said, that's perfect. Because, obviously SEA, but nonetheless, it seemed to work. Floated his boat, pun intended. And before too long, then the thought was, well, why don't we tell Richard Branson about this? He loves to do spectacular things for publicity. He'd love to drive to France without going on a ferry or a tunnel. Don't think there was a tunnel back then. So that's basically what happened. He drove the car to France. He went in this side and came out the other side with Neil Jenkins as his co-pilot. Neil was the CEO. It was an extraordinary experience. I loved working there. There were great engineers, a lot of them from Formula One, really smart people, a very quirky factory up in Nuneaton. But it was with, classic, brilliant British engineering.
So exciting stuff. A little skeptical that a car that's a boat drives well. So your credibility, your performance of a car just went a little bit sideways because I can't imagine a boat and a Lotus drive well together at the same time. So
no, you'd be surprised because they tested it. You would be if you Google it and look on the internet, you'll find a video. You'll find several videos, but one in particular where it's being tested, put through its tests at Millbrook, going through the Alpine circuit, all the parts of the Millbrook test facility that take a car to the very edge. And that car drove incredibly well. So to have both.
I'll take you at face value, although still skeptical because that's hard to believe. But we're on a show about EVs, right? And so you talked about Lotus. The Lotus car was also a platform for this thing called Tesla, I think they made the early Teslas on that thing as well. So it seems to be an early prototype for people to use. How did you go from selling cars and car boats to EVs?
Good question. I worked for London Taxis, and London Taxis make the black cab, the ubiquitous black taxi. And they flirted with a hybrid taxi in about 2004, 2005. And unfortunately didn't progress with it, partly because it was expensive technology. The vehicle was very price sensitive. It's not a cheap vehicle anyway, the London Taxi. And to cut a long story short, the chairman of the company was very passionate about having cleaner vehicle technology, especially with taxis, and championed it, but the rest of the board wasn't wasn't struck with it, didn't want to do it. So he kind of was that frustrated by the situation that he cashed in his chips, and he basically started an electric vehicle company called Modec. I think the original plan, I wasn't there right at the very beginning, the original plan was to have an electric taxi, but that quickly moved into having an electric van. So back in 2007, the spring of 2007, Modec had an electric van, 5.5-ton gross vehicle weight, with a lithium ion battery. Oh, sorry, initially it was Zebra, sodium nickel chloride, but within about 12, 18 months, it then had an LFP battery, LIFEPO4, a battery with cells from Thundersky in China packaged into a battery pack, modules in a pack by Axion up in Dundee. And when you think of where we are now with the whole narrative around, well, LFP is the way to go for this and that and the other reason, it's as though it's a new chemistry. It's not at all. It's been around a long time, but we chose it, or the engineers chose it. Nothing to do with me. I wasn't in any way responsible for anything to do with the technical side of the vehicle. There were some gifted engineers there in terms of understanding electrification, understanding energy density, all of the performance aspects of a battery pack, a motor, a combined motor inverter that we use from Zytec. In truth, the capability of that company was in integration and in software. It wasn't so much, the IP sat within the supply chain, quite frankly. But nonetheless, an amazing period to be part of an exciting adventure, and that's where my whole EV thing kicked off.
And what happened to Modec? Where did it go? Why do we not see Modec running around today?
What a good question, Neil. Look, the company launched in spring 2007. I think you'll know, and most of the listeners will know, in 2008, the summer of 2008, we hit the financial crisis and the world starts going into tailspin. Anybody who's in business struggled. If you were a startup selling a pretty expensive electric vehicle proposition, you struggled even more. The irony was, up until the moment that banking crisis hit, we got to the point where oil was, I think it was $146.20 a barrel. It had got up to the highest price it was, and people with petrol and diesel cars, especially fleet operators, were panicking like mad, like, where the heck is this going to go? This is going to crucify us. So the electric vehicle, for a short window of opportunity, was, well, that's clearly the way to go. But of course, we then essentially suffered all of the aspects of where we were with the financial crisis and ran out of money. And basically, we didn't go somewhere. There is an extended story to this. I'll truncate it because we're not going to speak forever. There was a moment in 2010 when the then Chinese ambassador to the UK, Madame Fu Ying, invited Modec to go and set up in China. They chose not to. But what Madame Fu Ying, I met her, she said it to me. She explained that the Chinese had ambition, great ambition, for what she called new energy vehicles, and that the Chinese were going to go on a tremendous journey of renewable energy, new energy vehicles, aka electric vehicles, and that Modec, was an exciting young company, and we should go to China, and they would help us, without going through all of the politics and discussions, because it's probably not going to be appropriate. We didn't go. We should have gone. The rest is history.
And China's a fascinating country when it comes to electric vehicles. You've been out there, haven't you, recently?
Well, not for a while, actually. Probably not for 3 years. Last time I was out there was 2019 for the Shanghai Auto Show. So not for some time, for the obvious reason. But yeah, it is fascinating. And if you contextualize not just electric vehicles, but where we are in the world geopolitically, in many elements and aspects of life, commerce, politics, etc., this begins with the father of modern China called Xi Jinping. Sorry, not Xi Jinping. That's a Freudian slip. Deng Xiaoping. Xi Jinping would like to think it's him, but it's actually Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping understood that China needed to be reinvented and that a hybrid system of communism and capitalism was possible, and that at the core of that would be education, would be to ensure that you had an educated, aspirational, entrepreneurial world where and then you had a plan. So and quite frankly, if you look and read and understand the journey that that country went on from those times of Deng Xiaoping progressing that plan, it's astonishing. And it gives you the clues as to why they've got to the place they're at now, and how they're sustaining that place and prevailing that place, and the things we didn't do in the West. And it's nothing to do with communism versus capitalism. It's to do with individuals. It's to do with intellect. It's to do with planning. It's to do with a number of things which are common to all peoples around the world.
So yeah, so I think from where I sit, I see China as accelerating in the EV world, right? They've gone from battery technology to being a leader to number of cars sold. Um, where does China play in your perspective in EVs today, and where are they headed? Because so you said they had aspirations very early on. That's what your story just showed us, that early on they had reached out to you in the early innings. But where are they today, and where are they headed?
They are the dominant force. They are the new empire. They are the new Detroit. They are the new Stuttgart. They are now in a position where, in combination with one other manufacturer, Tesla, to dominate the landscape for a host of reasons. One of the big ones is the battery. So the two key players in China that give that country and its OEMs such a strong position are BYD, run by a pretty mercurial leader, Chairman Wang, and he's a chemist by profession, and he's progressed a business around the battery that then became a car company. It may have been the other way around, but anyway, it does both. It does both incredibly well. You even now see BYD batteries, what they call the Blade battery, in Tesla vehicles, amongst others. And then the other company is a company called CATL. And this is an extraordinary story. So an entrepreneur called Robin Zeng set up the company and has basically built the biggest battery company in the world, bar none. 1/3 of all the battery cells used in the world are made by CATL. It's easier to say what cars their batteries are not in rather than what they are in. And I recently met the former CTO of CATL, an American. And the story he has to sell, Bob Gallion is his name, is extraordinary. He was a GM veteran. He'd been at GM for a long time, couple of decades. And then he'd worked at Magna. He'd been the boss at Magna and a few other companies. He's invited by Robin Zeng in the early days to go and help him progress this company, which is nothing at the time, really, to speak of. And through, great planning, focus, incredible hard work, bringing the right people together and just getting on with it. The story that emanates a lot out of China when you talk to the people that have been principals in its progress, what you come away with is a pretty simplistic fact, which is they do it rather than keep talking about it. You know, our politicians, particularly in the West, are forever having reviews, discussions, plans, mantras, so on and so on and so forth. And rarely do they actually either stick their hands in their pockets or make something happen. And this is the significant difference between China and the West. They act, we talk.
But is China concerned about the global market or their market, right? So they make a lot of cars. They've accelerated in a lot of technology. There's probably some bias against Chinese cars, but I think in the chat I'd sent, hey, I like this Volvo partnership I've seen. I hear they have a great vehicle that people are embracing here in Europe. Is China trying to dominate the world of EVs, or are they just trying to solve a local problem?
So they were always playing catch up with the internal combustion engine car. They were always a couple of iterations behind that. They were never going to catch up. They were certainly never going to overtake with combustion engine cars. So For various other reasons, they wanted to progress electric vehicles, predominantly, by the way, to do with air quality. It was the key driver. Bob Gallion explained this to me, which was how Robin Zeng was focused. It was about a number of principal cities that had dire consequences of rapid industrialization in terms of air quality, not just cars, but vehicles, but they were a big part of it. And we should say vehicles, by the way. So I'm definitely including buses, taxis, vans, and trucks, as well as cars. And then their formulation of a strategy, which then articulates in a plan called Made in China 2025, which emerged in 2015, was predicated on dominating the world of electric vehicles globally. And that's what they're now doing. And so this has been done in full sight of all the European and American OEMs, all of the politicians from everywhere, and nonetheless, we've essentially ignored it. And then they bring in Tesla, the first company to not be mandated to have a joint venture. Why do they do that? They want to inspire and challenge their own domestic manufacturers. So sticking this, fox in the hen house kind of thing, that really stirred everybody up. They also, in working closely with Tesla, wanted to learn from Tesla. The thing about the Chinese, it's not people, too much of the narrative, maybe more so in the past, was, well, the Chinese just copy people. You could call it that. But what they do is they learn from people. And equally, we can learn from them. So this whole kind of global thing now of where we are with climate change is about collaboration, is about us learning from each other. And certainly with the electric vehicle thing and supply chain especially, which we haven't even talked about yet, it's too late to compete with China. We now have no choice but to collaborate with China. And that's not part of some sinister plot that's been produced. This is just called life.
So the outlier that comes to my mind, living here in Switzerland with colleagues buying cars and EVs, is Hyundai in the Korean market. So Tesla as an American jumps up as the EV that I think, and I think of all the brands, and the VW group here in Switzerland comes to mind with all their EVs, or having ridden around in Jaguars that are electric. But I was really surprised at the dominance that I'm seeing with the Korean car market coming in as well. So you're telling me that China dominates, but I'm seeing a lot of high quality vehicles coming out of Korea now.
And you're seeing exactly the right thing. That is exactly what's happening. So it's, if you like, a rising tide lifts all boats. And that's predominantly been happening in Asia. So the ability to build great batteries, in some of the companies, not just CATL, of course, Panasonic, Samsung, LG, and some of these are both, well, not just a few are Japanese, of course. They've been at batteries for a long time, consumer electronics before all of this, but they slightly fell off the perch to a certain extent. But the batteries that are equally impressive, including chips and software as well, are definitely in Korea. So you're absolutely right. South Korea and Hyundai and Kia, these big conglomerates, have equally been, like I said, a rising tide lifts all boats. That arena, that part of the world, Asia, has become incredibly advanced, super smart, and got on with it.
So it reminds me of the old days. I don't remember the old Datsuns and Toyotas back in the 70s when they were tinny and nobody wanted them. And suddenly they dominated the entire U.S. market. They had the Honda Accord, and you had the Datsuns became nice metal cars. So Hyundai, I think, went through that, but at hyper speed, in my opinion. Right? You watch them come into our market with kind of iffy cars, long warranties, but from the EV market, like you said, I think people are choosing them over the alternatives. Is what I'm seeing left and right.
Oh, they absolutely are. I mean, let's put it very simply. The two biggest car companies in the world have been, for many years, Volkswagen and Toyota. The two most vulnerable car companies in the world right now are Toyota and Volkswagen. Because they're so big, they make so many internal combustion engine vehicles, blending in the mix of electrification is inevitably the biggest challenge that anybody faces. If you're a clean sheet operator, if you, like Tesla, have only ever made that's easy. But there are clues in how to do this, because BYD have made combustion engine cars and electric vehicles. They only make electric vehicles now. So they've managed to wean themselves off this very successfully. And I'm surprised that some of the Western OEMs haven't kind of, or maybe they have, observed how that worked. What was the chronology? What was the plan? Because, it's very complex, but within these big companies, Toyota and Volkswagen in particular, you have huge hierarchies, powerful hierarchies of people that don't want change. I'm convinced there are thousands of managers in those two companies that really rail against this whole electrification thing and hope it'll just go away. Why can't Elon Musk just get on a bloody rocket and go to Mars and leave us all alone? Because but they're like King Canute. They're sat there with the tide coming in, trying to push it back, and it's not going to go back. They're going to drown if they're not careful.
And what's really interesting is seeing some new names emerging in this marketplace. And most people will have heard of Tesla and Volkswagen. That's fairly easy. And probably people have heard of the Volvo Polestar and then go, oh, maybe that's Chinese owned. And then you've got your kind of Maxus and your MG that's now kind of Chinese owned. And then you go, what about these new names? Because there's a bunch of new names coming to market that, people are really, starting to sit up and listen because they're like, China's arrived, when actually China's been here for quite a long time. What are some of the new names coming to market at the moment?
NIO. When I've been out in China, I've been to a number of NIO events. They have what they call a NIO Day, where all the customers and all the people who've got on order come into a big arena. It's like a pop concert. And William Li, the kind of charismatic Elon Musk type co-founder, comes on stage and shows them the new product and tells them all the exciting stuff. And it gets, a really exciting showbiz, atmosphere. And this is a company now championing battery swap, which was tried and sadly failed with Better Place. And so the curious thing here, just jumping around a little bit, 10 years ago in about October this year, 10 years ago, I had the opportunity at Westfield shopping centre, the opening of the Tesla store there. So I wasn't getting any special treatment. I was just in the crowd like everybody else. But I get the chance to ask Elon Musk a question. And I said, out of battery swap, wireless charging, and cable charging, Elon, what's the journey going to be and will one of them prevail? And Elon said, well, I think mostly cable charging, fast cable charging. And he said that he was very polite. He then said, wireless charging is problematic with alignment and power. Battery swap, he said, we've engineered it into the Model S, so we will actually show it. And if there's a demand for it, we might do it. Subsequently they didn't. That's another story as well. But and then of course, because Better Place failed, this was a fascinating company. Again, mercurial leader Shai Agassi tried something, didn't work. But then people often, foolishly, in my view, in history, look at things and say, oh, it didn't work, so it won't ever work. No, maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the people. Maybe it was something else. So now you see that the Chinese government are hugely supporting battery swap for a host of reasons, which maybe we haven't got time to go through and into. But there is a lot of merit of having battery swap, and some of that merit is counterintuitive to how people see batteries and energy.
What do you mean about counterintuitive? How is it counterintuitive? Because battery swapping has obvious issues. You've got to get some standardization. But the reality is, how do you then, why is battery swapping a completely bad idea? Why did it fail last time? Why might it succeed now?
Okay, the counterintuitive aspect is that the struggle is to build enough batteries for any EVs anyway. Why would we want to build all these extra batteries that hang around in a battery switch station? Well, they're not hanging around in the switch station. They are part of the integration into an ecosystem of energy management. They will be in localized facilities all over big towns and cities managing the grid. They will work into the microgrids and even maybe the bigger grids. They have two jobs. Their job there is to manage that movement of energy, particularly renewable energy storage, the intermittency, and be ready as and when they're needed to go into an EV. So that's the bit that's counterintuitive. It's not making extra batteries that are just going to do nothing. That they're doing something very significant, which was always part of the plan. When I went with Professor Dave Greenwood to Better Place in Israel many years ago, we saw how they were doing it. They had like a national grid facility where they had a big screen, big system, where you could see all of the battery switch stations. There were plenty of those, and you could see where all the batteries were, the state of charge of those batteries. So it was an amalgamated feedstock of energy storage. And this is the stuff that people kind of missed. Maybe it wasn't presented well enough. Again, the timing, like with Modec, it was just, the wrong time, etc. So yeah, that's battery swap. And then we could talk about wireless if you want, because wireless charging is something I believe in hugely as well.
Yeah, I remember some early trials, and I think they were in the UK, where they put charging in the road, and you could theoretically drive in a lane and charge your car, and it seems kind of utopian. So, what happened, and why don't we see this still coming?
Well, I'm not so sure where that was in the UK, but I'm pretty certain it's in Scandinavia. It's Electrion, and again, Israeli company, um, and Renault have tried it. There have been many people that have tried it, and it hasn't worked for a number of reasons. Actually, having what you term dynamic wireless charging, which is vehicles moving, the laws of physics and the amount of copper required, and a number of other things, in my humble opinion, and that view of many people I've encountered, is just not feasible. But if you look at opportunity charging a little and often in vehicles that are on closed loop operations like buses, taxis, vans, at ports, at airports, vehicles where the duty cycle can accommodate being able to charge a little and often on a regular basis, there is a huge merit for wireless charging. Again, go back into the battery aspect, which sits at the heart of all of this. If you then roll around with a 60 kilowatt, 50 kilowatt, 40 kilowatt battery pack, which is weight and cost, and nominally it can give you 60, 70, 80 miles or whatever on whatever vehicle, if you don't need that, you can maybe half or even put a 10 kilowatt battery pack in something. Because if you then put the range into the infrastructure, rather than having it on board, that's going towards a paradigm shift in how energy and mobility works. So, and there are now companies coming to market, and let me tell you who is about to come to market with it, because for me, this then triggers the credibility of everything. Tesla will this year, in my opinion, and from reading the signs, this year will show people and offer up to the market wireless charging of Tesla cars. I'm 100% certain about it. In fact, they recently bought a German company that can deliver this capability. They bought the company outright. So, and they've done this with a few technologies, as you know, I'm sure, along the way. So they do try to design in-house. If they can't do that, they'll then buy something and then probably bring it in-house and make it even better. So that's where Wiferion is the company. I'm just trying to conjure up the memory here. Wiferion, German company. I followed them for a little while. They're very, very interesting. And I'm under a little bit of a legal thing at the moment with somebody, but I can't be explicit about that. But from the beginning of August, I'm going to be doing something different again in the wireless charging space, because I'm a huge advocate for it, because I believe it's going to help us deliver better range, reduce the need for ever more, ever bigger batteries, and a bunch of other things.
And how do you see us getting that wireless charging? Is it going to be the dream for my wife, where she pulls up on the driveway, parks over a pad, and happy days? Or is this just for taxis? You only get it in certain locations. You're going to have to pay a premium. It's going to be slower, or it's going to be faster. It's going to be better. Where do you see this happening first?
Okay, well, like I think a lot of technology adoption, I'm old enough and ugly enough to remember when you could first get a mobile phone, certainly in the UK, around early 1980s. It would cost, I think, in real terms, probably now £3,000 or £4,000 or £5,000. It's a big thing. You could get it in your car. People who worked in the city of London had it in the car. They had a few masts up the M4 into Surrey or wherever, wealthy people used to live. And that's how it worked. Then over time, you saw the infrastructure develop in terms of cellular masts and that whole cellular coverage network, 1G, 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, where we are now. And you saw then the adoption of the mobile phone to what it is today. So to answer your question, your wife will have wireless charging. Yes, I would. If I put a date on it, I'd probably say 3 to 5 years. But in the short term, I think it will be mass adopted by bus operators, truck, van, taxi operators. And I think that adoption enables the industry to then bring down the price of the receiving pad, the price of materials. Scale always in all these things allows you to bring down piece cost. That's always how it's worked.
So we can see wireless charging coming. We've talked a little bit about battery swapping and the fact that in many ways for people who drive a Neo car, it's already here, although there's probably not that many battery swap stations quite here in the UK yet. What else do we see coming down the road? What's the future look like? And what else can we do to tackle that nasty air quality climate change issue we're trying to deal with right now?
Well, I don't want to be a contrarian in saying this, and I'm not trying to just be different, because this is something I've believed in, well, for a long time. I don't think mass adoption of electric vehicles will ever happen, nor should it. The reason for that is, if you go to the most inefficient part of a vehicle, a car, typically a car, it's the utilization. So the utilization of a petrol or diesel car for most people is about 5 to 10% of the time of its time. And what's the utilization of an electric vehicle for most people? About 5 to 10% of its time. It's exactly the same thing. So 90% of the time, this incredibly valuable asset sits there doing nothing. Now, when maybe we were making the number of vehicles with the population that we had in the past, we kind of could get away with that. It kind of worked. But going towards a world where, trying to build, 70 million cars every year with a 60, 70, 80 kilowatt battery in them is stretching the realms of possibility, quite frankly. So to be specific, we will see mass adoption of buses, taxis, vans and trucks, electric. They will deal with and manage the air quality issue. We will see expensive, flashy, call them what you will, electric vehicles for people that can afford them. So it's going to split. The market's going to split. I think the 30 or 40 million cars that would have been made for people to buy and own in some fashion, that will, over the next decade or two, disappear as we see the emergence of shared vehicle platforms, autonomous vehicle propositions, and more people living in cities anyway. So even without a technology shift, if you live in a city, what the hell do you want to own a car for? It's an inconvenience. It's not the other way around. So yeah, I believe for a long time that mass adoption of electric vehicles won't happen. And that, if I'm right, that cuts across so many aspects of, well, how many chargers do we need? Where do we put the chargers? What's going on with batteries? How many gigafactories do we build? These things are all interwoven. They're like a Rubik's Cube. The different facets, the different aspects of technology, culture, politics, resources, and you click them all around and they change, and you have to know the algorithm to actually get the colors all to match up. And I think the algorithm going forward is to have a hugely more focused civilization on sharing than owning.
So you've turned from car guy into psychologist here. You're talking about a change of the way people live and what they do, right? And I guess one of the things you inadvertently just mentioned in that litany of things that need to happen for this to happen was, shared economy kind of things, self-driving cars and things like that. Is that fundamental technology? Because for me, if I'm trying to solve CO2 or air pollution in a city, I can still drive myself. In fact, I'm pretty happy driving a car that goes from 0 to 60 in 4 seconds, right? I mean, that's kind of fun. So do I need all this other technology for this to really be cool?
Possibly. But I think here's the other thing about the climate change narrative. It's too anchored in 3 or 4 particular things. It's anchored in cars, it's anchored in energy, it's anchored in aviation and maybe shipping. There are multiple elements and aspects to how does carbon get in the air? How do we go from 200 and something to 400 and something in 200 years? It was the Industrial Revolution, more than anything else. And then the use of coal, oil and gas, yes. But then, it's about consumerism. It's about the way in which people, behave. And we can carry on behaving like that. I like behaving like that. I like stuff, So in many aspects, what I'm advocating and talking about is, I'm suggesting I'm a hypocrite, and I am. But if we balance it against, well, let's not do too much, let's not change really much at all, let's just not worry about it. Are we going to see summers, in North Africa, well, across the whole equator? So let's not talk about the Mediterranean, people going on holiday, because that's almost a bit perverse looking at it like that. It's, countries around the world, whole communities being mobilized to leave where they've lived forever because it's just not sustainable anymore. So there's a pretty stark choice. Let's just carry on as normal and watch the world fry, or radically shift over time how we behave and what we do in order to survive as a species, and of course all the creatures around us. Because when people talk about, oh, it's damned hot, 40 something, whatever, let's go inside and stick the aircon on. What does a bird do? What does a dog do? What do all these wild animals do? It's not a nice thought. So yeah, I think, well, I'm not a psychologist. I look, quite simply, I'm just a storyteller. I just observe what things are happening and people are doing, and I try to extrapolate some of that, contextualize some of that, and then say what I see. That's it in a nutshell.
So because we all like a happy ending to our stories, what can you tell us about what you think might have to happen next? Who's going to have to really move and shape? We're going to see business model changes, regulation changes, technology changes. Tell us a happier story a happier ending to this story.
Okay, you could be either, sometimes people say this, you can be either one of two things. Cornucopian. Cornucopia was the horn of plenty, which was about, the evolution of using technology and progress, or whatever, or Malthusian. Malthus was this mathematician who suggested that we basically eat ourselves to death. We just disappear under our own way of behaving. I'm cornucopian. I think there are extraordinary capabilities amongst people to get stuff done, to improve things. Whether we can do it quickly enough is another matter. What we definitely have to do is start diminishing the aspect of geopolitics, and we have to find that sweet spot of having, yes, competition, but having much more collaboration. And I think as a species, we're capable of it because, so many times in history, we've gone to the brink and then found ourselves managing to walk back. So that is an optimistic view. It will be naive in some people's minds when they hear me say that. But I do think as a cornucopian, there are enough people, there is enough money, and money will trigger this more than anything else. Very good book, by the way, called Green Swans: The Coming Boom in Regenerative Capitalism by John Elkington. And that book articulates how we can actually mobilize the forces of beneficial change, and those forces will make a lot of money out of it. Sounds a bit cynical, but if you show people they can make a shitload of money out of doing the right thing, they'll do the right thing.
So this has been one of those incredible journeys where we've gone through a little bit of Richard Branson, we touched on Virgin, the Gibbs Quad, Modec. You have a huge respect for engineers, which I really like, being an engineer. We touched on China, we've done a bit of an air quality, we've gone through Musk, our friend Musk, got to talk about him at all times. Wireless, we touched on, a bit of the future, and ended on the cornucopian versus Malthusian debate. But from a personal perspective, what electric vehicle do you drive and why?
I drive an ID Buzz. 2 or 3 reasons. Number one, it's electric. Number two, it sort of looks a bit cool. Another reason would be, I think of all the Volkswagen electric products at the moment, it's the one where they've had a proper go at it. It's a bit different. And there's more right about the ID Buzz, I think, than there is in some of the other IDs, if I don't want to sound too kind of, accusative. But the predominant reason is I needed a big boxy vehicle to whack a big dog crate in the back. So I'm going to drive an EV, but I need a practical EV. And because I take my dogs out every day for a couple of hours, because they're big Vizsla dogs, hunting dogs, and I want to take them out safely, I have to have, a big lump. It's a big metal box. So it's mildly embarrassing to have this big sort of van, essentially. But that's what I have. That's what I drive. That's what I've got.
Very cool. Thank you very much.
So I want to thank you so much for coming on this episode. This has been a great journey, a great conversation. Thank you so much for being our guest today, Roger.
My pleasure, and yeah, very much appreciate the invite. So it's good news all round.
For our audience, we hope you've enjoyed this content as much as we have. It's been a fun show to make. It's been all over the place. I hope you've learned. If you have, don't forget to share this, subscribe, follow us on Facebook, and we'll see you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy EV mini series. Bye-bye.